everyone. So I just want you guys to stand up because I feel like that was a really long lecture. Thank you, Evan. But like, if you guys just want to like stand up and like stretch a little bit, that is a command. Yeah. Okay. See this? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, find your seats again. Yeah. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about typography in web design. And so even on the slide we have like a few examples of like different fonts that you can be using, and we've used a nice serif font for like the headline today. So sorry. So first of all, we have the CSS cheat sheet. It will exist on Ed. We will put it up and you guys could use it when you're working on your homeworks or labs, and later on your projects. It's pretty useful. It has some good like selectors that you can use, and also like some reminders on like margins, padding, all of that, like everything you just learned. And yeah, so we'll make sure that is up on Ed soon. So why is typography even important? Like, why are we learning about this? Like, I've been using Google Docs since like second grade. I don't need a lesson about fonts. Well, because fonts are very important in helping you just like perceive information, and like there are many like aspects to it, such as like color, weight, and all of that. And so like when we look at this message, because why is it important? Because it's very hard to read this, or even wow, or even this, yeah. So like these are all like factors that can weigh into our decision making when creating a website. So typography is a beautiful group of letters, not a group of beautiful letters. So this is like more so like into like the decisions that you're making. Once again, when we're choosing a font, like yes, calligraphy is beautiful, but sometimes it's very hard to read, and we'll talk about accessibility in a little bit. So typography is one of like the main things that helps you like understand like what a website is. For example, when we're using a more modern font that is conveying a more modern vibe, and when we're using a more formal font, such as like Times New Roman, that's obviously like giving a little bit more of a formal vibe to it. And this like leads into branding, where like branding can showcase a variety of emotions through type. So like with this like coffee shop logo, like it has like a very distinct like I don't know how to explain it. It's just like very distinct, and it's not just like Arial, you know. So like if you think about like I don't know, like Facebook, I feel like they have like a pretty like distinct, or Google even, like they're very like clean fonts, but like when you see it, you kind of like know, oh yeah, that's Google. Like if Google like all of a sudden like changed to like I don't know, like Comic Sans, you'd notice, you know. So it's like very much so like into like their branding and all that. Okay, so like as we are creating websites, a lot of the information that we are putting onto it is like 80% usually like text. And so making choices about our typography and the fonts that we're using is very important. And so we usually are conveying like font and typography through size, weight, and color. And so like here on the right, we have like a little like example of the website. So we have at the like top, we have a nav bar where so sorry, where like home is a darker saturation, so that it's more noticeable, and then next to it is like a little like sub headline for like you to put like other information that isn't necessarily as important, but we will get to that later. And then we have a headline, another sub headline, and then the body text. So how do we make typography work? Yeah, so we have two main font types. We have serif fonts and sans serif fonts. So sans actually means without in French, and so sans serif means without flick, where serif means flick. So like if that helps you at all to understand what sans serif is versus serif fonts. So serif fonts are like fancy fonts like Times New Roman, and I don't know any other serif fonts, to be honest, aside from Times New Roman. But yeah, so it helps us feel like very classy and very formal, and like when you like scroll through like your Google Docs fonts, you think, probably find those based off of whether they have little feet or not. Then we have the sans serif fonts, and those are the ones that don't have a flick, and those are like our more modern fonts. So like those are like Arial, Helvetica, like Carla, which is what I think this slide deck is in. So like here are some more examples in actual websites. So on the left with Vogue, we have the feet on our like letters. So like with Vogue, it's like edged down instead of just like the G ending here. Yeah. And then with Nike, we have the more like formal, more modern, more technical font. And so that again goes back into like the branding of our fonts and how that comes into like branding of websites. So here are more examples with more like text heavy websites. So on the left, we have a serif font again with our feet on, wait, yes. Yes, that is feet. So we use serif fonts for text heavy content because that helps us like kind of like separate out letters a little better and like be like, okay, yeah, this is the end of my letter and here's the next letter. So it's easier for us to read serif fonts. And then sans serif fonts are for more image heavy content because we don't have to like decipher like what words are separate from each other. And like fun fact, people say that you should use serif fonts on your resume so that when people are reading it, it's easier to read. So we use weight to create proper hierarchy. So like if we look at the bold versus the medium versus the light, we have very like different weighting of our fonts. So with the bold, we usually use that for like headlines because that is more like eye-catching. If we look at the box, like it's very like long, but not like thin. So like it's very like distinct from the body text, which is like more like wide and long. Yeah. And then with our subheadlines, we don't want it to overtake our headline, but we also want it to be a little bit bigger than our like body text. And so that's why it's more of like a middle ground in like height versus width, if that makes sense. So like if we just took like one line of the light would be like really thin, and then the subheadline would be a little thicker, and then the bold would be a lot thicker. So generally, when we're making websites, we want to stick to 2 or 3 fonts. Again, this kind of goes back to like branding of our websites. If we're using like a different font for every single section of our website, it gets a little like confusing to the mind. Like, oh, like why is everything like kind of different from each other? And so like this also helps with consistency. So like we probably use like one font for like headlines and then one font for body text. And like if you want it to be fancy, like maybe another one for like your nav bar or something like that. Okay, so type is not really like an exact science because it's aligned when it feels aligned. When we get to like the Figma lesson, we have like tools that are built into Figma that can help you align text, but sometimes, especially if you're working with like different types of fonts, the spacing that is built into the type is a little different. So if I aligned them to the left, they might be a little bit off because inside the font, it's like a little bit of spacing or a little bit of padding. So when we're making like alignment, sometimes it's just right to like use your eye and like kind of like guesstimate it. And usually you can get away with it. Okay, so usually grids can be helpful. So here are like some grids that help us organize our website. So we have a square grid, a 12-column grid, and a 5-column grid. And so like maybe like it will help us like align where our like text goes, but sometimes it's not aligned. And so here's like a better example of like what I was saying earlier, where like sometimes there is a little bit of padding built in to the font. And so you just like have to like shift it over a little bit and like eyeball it. So back to weights. So we have, most fonts have a light, regular, medium, and bold in a typeface. And so it's usually really helpful when you're like browsing fonts to like see if they have these options, because if they do, then it makes your life a lot easier when you're like building a website, so that instead of having to choose different fonts, you could just be using different weights, and you'll still be staying consistent with the font type. And so when we're making big like body text, we like to have around line spacing of around 1.2 to 1.5, because yeah, it just like makes your life a lot easier when you're trying to read. I'm sure you guys don't really like reading like single spaced lines because like your eyes get, or at least for me, my eyes get really like tired trying to like focus on each line. And so like for accessibility reasons, like 1.2 to 1.5 is usually pretty good. And then for text width, we also usually want to stick between 40 to 70 characters per line. So that's like what you're changing with your like width of your text boxes. And again, it's like just for like aesthetic purposes. Yeah, again, typography is not a science. There's also like contrast that we can use, so that it like once again like gives a different message, I guess. So like for example, like in the top when we have a lighter font weight, like that might not be as like important of a thing for you to be noticing. Whereas if we're using a heavier weight, maybe that's like, oh, this is our home button, so please click this if you need to go back to the home. So once again, typography is not a science. There's a lot of like experimentation to it, a lot of like just like practice and like looking at things and seeing like, oh, like does this look good to me? Like if not, maybe I'll like ask someone for help or like for a second opinion. But remember that we're using like size, weight, and contrast to help us like create nice looking websites, and typography is a big part of that. Okay, so now how do we choose a font? Why can't I just use Comic Sans for all of my websites? So usually we like to use Google Fonts because it's pretty accessible to all users, especially with like connecting like fonts and like linking them to your assets in your website. Google Fonts has a lot of different fonts that you can just browse, and there's a lot of filters that you can use to like give you something that you hopefully like. And then it also like shows you like what types of weights they have. So here we have light to bold. There's also typesample.com. This is also another website that you guys can use. Highly recommend. It gives a lot of examples. And again, like, oh, like Google also does this too, but you guys can like sometimes like type in sample text. So for example, if you're like making a logo for a specific like group, you can like type in that group's name and then see like, oh, like which font looks like the best. And like sometimes like with all of the words just like stacked on top of each other, you can like make a better decision. Yeah. There's also Typewolf, which is also basically the same thing, but it's just another resource for you guys to use. There's also What Font, and so here is an example of like just like information that you can gather from the websites. So here it's telling us like, oh, like what style, what weight, size, line height, and color, which is all very useful information. Oh, so just remember that there are many exceptions and that like you can use many styles to communicate through type, and it's not necessarily just like limited to like Latin like alphabet. Like there's also Korean Google fonts, and like there's like so many things that you guys can experiment with. There's also like these fonts that look pretty cool. It's like I feel like fonts are very like you can like dive into like graphic design with it, you know? And so like it's always very fun to just like go through Google Fonts and just like see like, oh, like, what cool fonts are there today? Like sometimes like there's like disjoint fonts that aren't really easy to read, but they look cool sometimes. And like maybe you just like change around the weights, then it looks like more readable and like more usable. I don't know. But yeah. So do you have any questions? Sorry, I kind of sped through that. No? Does anyone have a favorite font? Yeah. Cambria? I like, yeah. I like, I can't think of what that is. Mm, why do you like it light? Does it come with different weights? Okay, amazing. Yeah. I feel like that's something that isn't in scope for this class. I think like if you wanted to talk about it, I know that you could change it in Adobe Illustrator. I don't know if you can in Figma, but we could talk about that. Yeah, I've like run into cases where like I find a font that I really like, but then like they don't have bold, and I'm like, bro, like, but like there are ways to like work around that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. I also just want to say, like, later when we work with like putting fonts into our websites, like linking them was low key a challenge for me when I was working on my website. So feel free to like just like ask questions about it or even like Google it. I think Google is pretty helpful in this class. It's like a easy way to get your questions answered or like simple questions answered. But if you guys get stuck, feel free to ask. And yeah, thank you for being here. You guys are free to go.